Hi everyone and welcome to this Queenager newsletter. This is the 29th of March and it's about how there's a backlash but there's still hope. So this is, if you'd like to read this rather than listen to me read it, then go to noon.org.uk and sign up to the newsletter and then it will be delivered to your inbox. This is the kind of video and podcast version for those who would rather listen. Thank you so much for spending a bit of your Sunday with me or whenever it is that you're listening to this. So I think at the moment it's quite easy to feel downcast despite the beautiful spring sunshine we've had for some of this week, when we look around us at the state of the world, not just the war in the Middle East, but the pushback against the sense of social progress that has accompanied us through most of our lives, certainly as Queenagers. I've been thinking about this particularly because last week I had dinner with a great old friend and mentor, Sylvia Hewlett, she's called. She's an academic, an economist, a best-selling author, and I think most of all a true champion of social mobility, diversity and women for all of her 80 years. When we met last week, she just celebrated her big 80th birthday. You wouldn't know it to look at her. She ran an organisation called the Centre for Talent Innovation out of New York for about a decade, which boasted scores of huge global companies as its members and did groundbreaking research on what really moves the dial kind of on inclusion, how we get different kinds of folks into the corridors of power. But really what I'm interested in Sylvia is the lady herself, because she truly embodies the progressive forces which have created a wind behind women for the last half a century. She absolutely defines the kind of sense of women who wanted more than domesticity, who wanted a life and an expanded horizon. She really is that social mobility story made flesh. She was born in a very, very poor family in the Welsh Valleys, one of 5 daughters. Her mother spent most of her time wringing out sopping sheets in cold, wet mining village and walking miles along a busy road to take all her children to school. And through sheer intelligence and grit, Sylvia got herself to Cambridge University, the first person in her family ever to go to university. And when she got there, she's so brilliant on this. She talks about how she was told that she was uncouth because she had a strong Welsh accent, her clothes were all wrong, and she said her cultural knowledge was non-existent. She said to me last week when we were having supper, she said they were all talking about going skiing and politics. I didn't even know what a Tory was, let alone a red run in a ski resort. She said my gap year had been spent washing sheets in an underground hospital laundry in South Wales. She said I just didn't have the cultural hinterland. And she said she spent her first year at Cambridge completely tongue-tied because she just didn't have the vocabulary. She didn't understand what anybody else was talking about. Of course, as a smart woman, she soon got the kind of cultural fluency that she needed and ended up in Manhattan as an academic and married an American, and then became an economist and the author of best-selling books. And actually, she was a Queenager before there was even such a term, because it was at 53 that she became an entrepreneur and founded the Centre for Talent Innovation, which is when I met her. And she also had her final child, she has 5, when she was 51. We were talking last week at dinner about how in her life there'd been a constant sense that things were getting better for women, that it was constantly getting easier for a clever girl from the wrong side of the tracks to make it. But she said to me really sadly last week, she said, now for the first time, I really feel that progress is going backwards, and that it would actually be harder for Sylvia to make it now to Central Park West, where she lives in some grandeur, than it was back then. And we talked about the backlash we're currently experiencing as women within the workforce, and not just women, on kind of broader kinds of diversity. There's a piece in the New York Times today about how Peter Hegseth and Trump have taken a black woman and a black man off a list of possible generals because they're kind of they've got this kind of hatred around diversity, and that really is a kind of pushback against the progress of trying to get different kinds of people who didn't come from privileged backgrounds or weren't white men into the corridors of power. And the point of that is not some utopian project. The point of that is to make better decisions for all of us and to have a more inclusive take on what would make society work better. So it's really chilling, I think, to feel that there's a real kind of pushback, on all of that. when I first met her, she'd written perhaps her most controversial book, which is called Baby Hunger, which was about all the children that hadn't been had by professional women, which caused a kind of big conversation around the world. And I'm afraid it's still the case. And I remember meeting her when I was a Sunday Times columnist, going for dinner with her at the Savoy, and loving her diminutive stature, her steely intellect, and this wonderful kind of contrast between this little lady and this amazing mind. And we did a lot of running around together in Cannes. We did a big event with Martha Stewart at one point, and we're running around Cannes, kind of having a lot of fun. So she and I both have been... we've been kind of on the same lines and thinking about a lot of the same things for a long time. But anyway, so when we were talking last week, we were thinking that we didn't expect in 2026 that we would find ourselves talking about a situation in which progress for women has gone backwards. She said to me, which I hadn't quite clocked, that in the US now, there are less female CEOs currently than there were 3 decades ago. And so I had a look at the UK figures, and according to the latest FTSE Women Leaders Review, it describes progress in the UK on female leaders as stubbornly stalled. And they're right. When I first started writing about this in the mid-1990s, there were around 5 female FTSE 100 CEOs. And 30 years later, the number is 8 on a good day. I mean, that's slow progress at best. And yes, people say we've got more non-executive female directors, those NEDs. But to quote the review, this is not translated into more women in the top CEO roles. And it also hasn't translated into more women with their hands on levers, as Lucy Ryan talks about it. And the pipeline is leaking really fast. I think that the pipeline of female executives is leaking partly because of the whole thing about gendered ageism and the corporate world liking women who are pleasing, both in manner and physicality. But also Sylvia Hewlett and also the Lean In data point to the pandemic and said that the pipeline really leaked then because so many women, kind of senior women, were juggling not just big jobs at home, but teenagers. And, that was incredibly difficult. In fact, I talked about that with Sheryl Sandberg when I went to interview her just at the beginning of the pandemic. Anyway, the day that I had dinner with Sylvia, I'd had a bit of a kind of day on all of this because I'd attended an incredible afternoon event called Empower Her, organised by a woman called Vanessa Pezos, who runs a group to get women to invest in other women. And it was a wonderful day, amazing women talking about, very honestly, about supporting each other, about being a female entrepreneur, how hard it was, the kind of perfectionism of a lot of women and how we can be our own worst enemies, but also about the massive funding gap. The funding gap is that only 2% of venture capital goes to women, all women, not just older women. And the current system is really not changing. That 2% hasn't shifted for years. And so what we all concluded on that afternoon, it was a really interesting afternoon of about 60 incredible women, was that it was through co-creative and supportive communities like Noon and Noba Capital, which things will change. And I was also really chilled. I was sitting next to an incredible woman at the tea who works for a big global US bank and runs a program investing in startups and more diverse entrepreneurs. And she was saying to me that she's doing that, but she can't talk about it because it's a US bank and Trump's banned anything that smacks of diversity or equity in any company with US government contracts. So you can't have a diversity program or any DEI if you want to work with the American government. She isn't allowed to use any of those words anymore. So she just says, I'm still investing in diverse entrepreneurs, she said. I just can't mention the word diverse. She talks about creating a pipeline for bank customers of the future or, looking at kind of good business, but she can't mention anything progressive, which really I find quite depressing. And it reminds me of when I went to New York last year. I was interviewed for a big job at CNN. Very glad I didn't take that. And the head of HR there, an inspiring woman of colour, said, how did diversity and equity become dirty words? I think that is chilling. But what's so crazy about all of this is that the current backlash against women and the kind of, progress of other kinds of people into the top bit of leadership is pretty disproportionate to the actual progress made. The reality is that women and other people like us are just getting started. It's 100 years since women in the UK got the vote, but we're still in the foothills of this journey towards equality. many of our Queenager generation entered the workforce when we'd been given what I call the lanyard, i.e. we were allowed in, but the institutions that we entered were still entirely set up for men. They mostly still are. I remember when I got to my own Oxford College, there were no women on the walls anywhere. I felt I was there on sufferance. Women had only been allowed in for a few years, and like I was part of an unfolding experiment. It was a bit like that when I first joined the Sunday Times in the newspapers, when I would often be not only the youngest, but the only woman in the room. And everyone would turn to me and go, "What do women think?" And I go, "Well, there are quite a lot of us. It's not just me." I mean, of course, women have made big strides. We've got the Equal Pay Act, we've got parental leave, but we're really nowhere near equality. Women are still pregnant and then screwed. And as we're seeing, loads of Queenagers are also being pushed out of the workforce. And we're nowhere are we promoted as quickly as men. But that's not how it feels to many men out there. I mean, I write a lot of columns for The Telegraph, some of you will know that. And I'm always completely mystified by the kind of backlash in the comments. I get accused of discriminating against men because I push for more representation of women. But I'm always saying to them, look, we're not even there yet. I mean, it feels to be extraordinary, the very strong backlash against women and the way I get attacked in the comments sections there. You would think that there were 92 women running our top 100 companies and only 7 or 8 men in charge, when the reality is actually the reverse. The world is still completely run by the same, patriarchal white men as it ever was. But the intensity of the backlash against women is so not in proportion with the extent of our progress at the top. Although I do agree that within society more broadly, the changes around women's equality are real. I mean, just think about it. We just got our first ever female Archbishop of Canterbury after 1400 years. And of course, there is a whole generation of educated, experienced Queenagers, like all of you, who have worked and have had a voice in these spaces and believe that we should be heard and that women have a right to have an effect on the world. And ditto, we've brought up daughters who expect equality. They expect to have the same kind of life chances as the men around them. But the misogyny currently out there is real. Even the tiny levelling of the playing field in terms of equality that Sylvia campaigned for and many of us Queenagers have been a part of is seen as overwhelming and threatening to the patriarchal order. The blowback is in part, I think, why we're now living in what feels like a bit of a global manosphere, led by Trump, J.D. Vance, and the likes of Peter Hegseth, the US Secretary of State for War, who was once just a crazy manosphere Fox News pundit, and I'm afraid now is running the world and raining fire down on innocents from the sky. And let's not forget, it was the podcasters of the online manosphere which helped put Trump and his cronies into the White House in the first place. I've been thinking about that and the Manosphere because I finally got round to watching the Louis Theroux Manosphere documentary, which I'm sure some of you have been watching on Netflix. There was a big chat about it on the Noon London WhatsApp. And like many of you, I agree, I found it profoundly sad, but also a bit pathetic and preposterous. It made me think, who are these sad little man boys with their pumped up muscles and dumb reasoning who ignorantly blame the Jews or the Matrix or feminism for all their troubles? Many of those featured in the documentary seem to, more interestingly, I think, grew up in fatherless households, dysfunctional homes, and they felt to me like wounded little boys playing at being grown-ups. The muscly preening, the obsession with how many women they'd slept with, and a total lack of morality about how it was that they made their money. They couldn't join the dots. They struck me as a bit pathetic and sad, and all of it as a kind of Alice through the looking glass world, a weird mentality, a fantasy world of subjugated women and unchecked male power and aggression. I think the most depressing bit of it, actually, the saddest, was the beating up of some alleged predator, obviously for extra clicks, because they had a kind of, a bit like a snuff movie. They had him being beaten up in real time. I watched it with my husband, who was horrified by the depiction of manhood, and really made a plea for all the men who are not like that, which I really second. Because, of course, there is a whole other kind of masculinity rooted in protecting the weak. Think of firemen or knights or, gentlemen, or all the lovely men out there who support the women that they love all the time, who are good fathers and good husbands. So many men I know who love and support and respect women as their fellow human beings and want them to progress. And the truth is that men don't really benefit from patriarchy either. Only a very few, who are right at the top and who kind of make the rules for everyone else. I think what the Manosphere documentary did explain quite well is that these men feel to create themselves, to escape a victim narrative, how they want to become masters of their own destiny. Years ago, I interviewed Jordan Peterson, kind of, daddy of the Manosphere. And I really agree with him that hard work and a sense of agency over our lives is crucial. He began by encouraging boys to get up, make their beds, get fit, work hard, make something of themselves, believe that they could do something with their lives with hard work. And I don't disagree with that. But I don't understand why that basic bit of self-discipline then has to morph or mutate into keeping women as chattels, keeping them in a kind of female lane where they're expected to cook and clean and, put up with what these men call one-sided monogamy, meaning that the men can shag whoever they want and the women are faithful, stay home and keep house. As we know, that's like straight out of the 1950s, and it didn't do women much good then. There was an interesting piece in The Telegraph last week, actually, by a whole load of modern women who tried being traditional wives and absolutely hated it and couldn't wait to get back to work. So I think that there are reasons why that whole kind of trad wife thing went out of fashion, or women were pushed back into being back in the kitchens in the 1950s after the war, and we've been kind of fighting our way out ever since. So it feels really depressing that a whole new generation think that trad wife is the way to go. And of course, the mentality is manifested in its worst aspect in terms of kind of Jeffrey Epstein and people like the horrible Tate brothers. Interestingly, all of those people are accused of rape and people trafficking, which implies that this idea of like putting women in this certain kind of box is not really one that works. And that is patriarchy at its most base and cruel. However, in the darkness and amidst the backlash, there is hope. The young people I know, including the young men, are overwhelmingly kind and courteous, good boyfriends, curious, gentle, concerned citizens. These young men I know look at the Manosphere and see a load of sad weirdos, certainly what I saw on the Through documentary. And certainly if I look at my own kids and their peers, overwhelmingly they eschew the ridiculous extreme performative gender roles beloved by Trump, the Manosphere, the kind of thing you see on the internet, the Kardashians, where men have muscles, guns and sports cars and women wear lycra and are submissive and kind of there basically to be slept with. And in fact, in many of the Gen Zs I know, they go by they pronouns, they look very gender fluid, and they wouldn't be seen dead in a bodycon dress or indulging in gym boy game talk of the kind of thing we saw in that Manosphere documentary. And this isn't an accident. For many years, I used to go into schools to talk about internet porn and ideas around sex with sixth formers. And I was struck by how many of the more kind of gender queer types came up to me afterwards saying that the great thing about being gay or gender neutral or non-binary was that you didn't have to play up to the extremes of masculinity or femininity as shown in internet porn, which they were being really kind of indoctrinated with. They said that the great thing about being in the middle was that you could make up your own rules. There was no template for what sex should look like or what you should look like. And in that, they found a huge freedom. And I think that there's something interesting there because the internet always rewards the most extreme content. And the smart kids are choosing to occupy the center ground where they can create their own rules, where the algorithm doesn't apply. And one piece of good news this week was the ruling against Meta and Google. A judge in America found them indeed to be embedding addictive extremist tropes into their algorithms to keep kids hooked. If you'd like to read more about this, I highly recommend a book, Careless People, written by a Meta insider.